extensive. It incorporates sort of Western canon, I would say particularly from the Bach B minor Mass to Tristan, and lots of stops in between, and incorporates a great deal of study of 20th century avant-garde music, beginning with the Symphony School. He talks about, writes on all of these subjects, and he has a particular love of, I think, what I would call very, very popular music, especially music of the 70s, and including some, I think, really some spectacular work on people like Cher, the Carpenters, Liberace, and yeah, and I think what's really interesting about his work in this area is that he takes his music seriously and has some quite extraordinarily interesting things to say about it. A good deal of this will be available in book form from the University of California Press. The title of the book is The Persistence of Sentiment, Essays on Display and Feeling in Popular Music. Mitchell also has an interest in connections of music and nature, ecology and nature, whale songs, and some, I think, interesting work in queer musics. So today, we're moving into television and sci-fi, and a talk on Battlestar Galactica. The talk is about an hour long. It includes 2 brief music clips and 2 fairly long DVD clips that he will be setting up for us, and then we'll have time for some questions afterwards. What I would suggest as you get hungry or thirsty, just get up and help yourself throughout, and we'll all leave in a very jolly mood an hour or so later. all of the wine is now here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I have been complaining to people for the last week as I was finally making my last decisions about what I could cram into an hour. That it was really a lot like working on film. It's just that the film was over 45 hours long. So it's really constantly a problem of timescale in dealing with television. There are a couple of rather lengthy clips because I think one of the important things to focus attention on is the way that the large-scale structures of the television show actually operate. At the same time, since it is television, we do have a little bit of some looseness in this, and so I do want to emphasize that you are encouraged. Please get up, get refreshments. We won't have real commercial breaks, but even so, it's the way of living in television. The other thing I would like to do before I begin is ask a very quick question. How many of you actually watch the reimagined Battlestar Galactica regularly? Okay, so some of you will actually hear, y'all will hear some things that you already know, but I'm trying to balance the amount of information for novices versus all those of you who are really experienced. So, the Sci-Fi Channel show Battlestar Galactica, now in the middle of its 4th and final season, has received a great deal of critical praise, not only for its exceptionally fine acting and high production values, but also, and most especially, for the way in which its stated goal of reimagining the hoary subgenre of space opera has intersected so brilliantly with the socio-political concerns of the 2000s. The reimagined show's primary creator and executive producer, Ron D. Moore, has always been explicit about his goal of creating dramatic reflections of post-9/11 America. And no one acquainted with the show would question that the goal has been successfully achieved. A little backstory can clarify the historical situation for those of you who don't know the new show. In the beginning, there was Battlestar Galactica, a short-lived television series that premiered in 1978 as part of a science fiction revival energized by the astounding success of Star Wars and the syndicated success of Star Trek. The original BSG, which is how I'm going to refer to it normally, was conceived by Glenn A. Larson, who adopted a number of elements from the Book of Mormon and Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, blending them with the Cold War concerns of the late 1970s. In this original series, the Cylons, who are robots created by an extinct reptilian race, have attacked a group of humans called the 12 Colonies of Cobalt, without provocation, forcing the human survivors to flee in search of the mysterious long-lost 13th colony known as Earth. Throughout the original television show, as well as its brief 1980s spin-off, bad guys and good guys are clearly demarcated, and the equation of the mechanically villainous Cylons with the Soviet Union was obvious to everyone who saw the original series. The show's dualistic tastes were, after all, perfectly congruent with the Reaganomic discourses that seduced the US in the 1980 political presidential election. Like Star Trek before it, BSG enjoyed a complex continuing life in fan culture. Fan fiction circulated more or less continuously in the wake of the show, supplemented by comic book adaptations, novelizations, games, published interviews with the show's creators, public appearances by the creators and various stars at science fiction conventions, and so on and so on. And like Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica's demotic hardiness was the ground of its later revivification. In fact, I should say, Moore, who's the new show's executive producer and wrote many of the episodes, had actually worked on no less than 3 of the later Star Trek series spin-offs, that is to say Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. Now, almost every aspect of the Star Trek franchise, its visual style, its ethical commitments, its acting, its narrative strategies, its musical tastes, all of these have always been highly stylized. What counts for cinematic and televisual realism has never been a high priority in the Star Trek universe. And by and large, that kind of stylization has also been the norm for most television science fiction, particularly those shows that operate in the realm of what we can call space opera. The reimagined Battlestar Galactica, by contrast, was planned to create a kind of science fiction verisimilitude that was more characteristic of some cinematic science fiction. One thinks of the Alien series, for instance, as a good example of this, and had made at least a partial appearance about a decade earlier in Chris Carter's influential X-Files. Important aspects of this realistic science fiction include the processes of handling dialogue and characterization, the show's editing and its camera work. You notice particularly in this a taste for handheld camera material and the adaptation of techniques that we actually normally associate with television news, as well as innumerable aspects of the show's mise-en-scène. And these qualities were arguably made even more intense by a rich panoply of narrative tactics deployed in the show. Much rides, I think, on the linking of this narrative complexity and the show's reality effect. Not only the particularities of the series from episode to episode, but also Battlestar Galactica's situation in the ongoing transformation of television as a medium in the 2000s. And all these are really part of the same tale. Now, to get to this, let me give you a moment's casual TV theory. Television programs, as we all have experienced, are famously much more porous, more amorphous, certainly less text-like objects than cinema films. The omnipresence of commercial breaks in network TV, as well as a lot of cable TV, for instance, is only one of the most obvious disarticulators of narrative. Glancing over the history of TV, we might actually also include aspects such as the evanescence of live TV before the era of regular taping and rebroadcasting. Most programs and television events from those early days of TV, of course, rapidly moved into the memory of collective narrative. In the age of syndicalization, really what I would date from the early 60s on, old shows could be repeated in endless cycles, and in fact, some of us may be old enough to remember reruns as the major mode of consuming earlier TV. But these reruns were often recut to add commercial space and played out of sequence. This was one of the primary spurs to the kind of standalone aesthetic of most major shows from the late 50s and the 60s. The spread of VCRs and especially DVDs in their seasonal boxed set format actually textualized television shows, at once stabilizing them by turning them from flow into product, we might say, but complicating the boundaries of that product by introducing a still proliferating range of paratextual materials. And anybody who owns a DVD box set will know that we often get things such as mini documentaries, deleted scenes, alternative versions of shows, voiceover commentaries, and production notes. And we'll leave aside, for the purposes of this talk, the increasing effects of TiVo and on-demand broadcasting on this sort of process of reconceptualizing TV. The television scholar Jason Mittell, observing that television studies have usually shied away from narrative analysis to focus on the medium's forms of social embeddedness, strongly advocates a consideration of strategies of narrative complexity, particularly as these have developed over the last 2 decades or so. Among its other effects, the entanglement of tale telling offers a tremendous spur to what Wayne Booth famously called coduction, the process by which we respond collaboratively, collectively, dialogically to help co-create a thing, not only the show but also the frame of discourse around it. As Mittell indicates, this process has a long history within fan culture, and again, the obvious touchstone is Star Trek. But what is different about the 90s and the 2000s is the way that this activity, this coductive process, has been increasingly mainstreamed into part of the normal process of dealing with the show. What this suggests to me is that our critical approaches to television might usefully pick up some of the qualities of various kinds of fan discourse, and we can talk about that a little bit later. And one of the most important of these qualities, I think, has to do with a strong sense of what a work is. Fan cultures, if you spend a little time on the internet looking at them, typically show a great deal of concern about deciding what is or is not canon. That is to say, what plot points, characterizations, backstories, modes of interpreting particular important events, and so on, are to be considered authoritative and necessary not only to evaluate aspects of the show as it continues as an ongoing concern, but also to create personal spin-offs, extensions, and variations for the consumption of the community. There's no question that in demotic understanding there are works, however fuzzy their borders are, and complex narrative, I think, is one of the ways that such objects can tend to be marked out for our attention. In this case, a kind of neo-formalist approach to a television series has the virtue of calling attention to the things most likely to figure in the coductive negotiations of Battlestar Galactica's primary and secondary audiences. And I have to say, this is a place where I think that musicological habits of interpretation can come in especially handy. It's in this context that I want to place Battlestar Galactica's Poetics of Sound. There are 2 issues I want to address briefly here. First, I want to talk for a little while about the general soundscape of the show. And second, I want to take up music's important role in structuring long spans of narrative. I'll close the talk with a few reflections on how Battlestar Galactica's sound resonates with a few larger thematic concerns of the show. Battlestar Galactica freely mixes an assortment of global materials to create a kind of semi-othered effect that's pretty much the dominant soundscape of the show. The human beings of the show, who are still in the reimagined series inhabitants of the 12 colonies of Cobol, tend to use familiar North American personal and place names with a slight demotic classical tinge. That is to say, people have names like Bill or Sam, but they also have names like Gaius. That is really, I think, the sort of normal texture of the show. Their material culture is mostly familiar too. Lots of Western-style garments, for instance, with the occasional Near Eastern or African costume. The inhabitants of the colony known as Geminon, for instance, who are all sort of religious fundamentalists, like to wear sort of dashikis and turbans and things like that. The machines, also, that are available to the colonials, which is what we'll call the humans, from their ships all the way down to their everyday possessions, are often interestingly retro in their technology. And just as an aside, I think this is an interesting attempt to solve what's a constant problem in science fiction television. Well, science fiction in general. As we all know, in watching cinema or TV, there are few things that date so quickly as fashion. Hairstyle is really kind of serious, but also clothes are. And if you take Star Trek, for instance, it is at the moments when the original series of Star Trek was trying to be most futuristic that in retrospect it looks most securely 1968. The idea that what is future is basket weave, bouffants, and go-go boots and miniskirts proves to be kind of ludicrous. And the problem with that, of course, is that the damage done to our sense of what is plausibly future ends up infecting everything else, so that the original series becomes really, really hard to take in an unironic fashion, or as a sort of historical period piece. Galactica's solution to this is to make everything look old from our point of view. and it's going to be really interesting to see how it ages, if that kind of deliberately retro effect ends up making it not seem so dated. We'll find out. Now, to come back to music. The variety of musics in Battlestar Galactica follows the globalized aesthetic that we find visually, with particular emphasis on the hodgepodge of denatured styles that we have come to call world music. That is, in the show's soundscape, we characteristically hear a vast range of non-Western or Western folk instruments. We hear duduk, we hear gamelan, we hear taiko, we hear erhu, we hear yali tambur, and so on and so on. Vocals are quite common in the music's soundscape, but they mostly use a kind of non-specific middle voice heading towards alto with generalized non-Western effects. Frankly, I tend to call this to myself the Lisa Gerrard effect, naming it after the female singer who was part of the duo Dead Can Dance. If you know very much about her career as a performer, she ends up getting a huge amount of work in Hollywood, right? She is on the soundtrack of Whale Rider. She's also on the soundtrack of Gladiator. And she's sort of part of that generalized ethnic, non-specific female other voice that really, by 2008, comes to stand in for anything that is removed from you in time. It doesn't have to be a temporally exotic place like ancient Rome, but it can be. It can be just anywhere that is other. And it's very non-specific in this way. The lyrics that we do hear in Battlestar Galactica are almost never in English. More often we hear vocables, or we hear exotic languages, such as Armenian or Gaelic, or Latin, it counts as an exotic language here, or Sanskrit or Sinhalese. There are a couple more, but those are some that we did definitely do here. Western orchestral music, Western orchestral instruments are actually fairly scarce in the show's soundscape. When they appear, they are usually strings with an occasional piano. What we do not get is the sound of a full orchestra, and I'll come back to that. In addition to this sort of generalized world music style, there's also the occasional appearance of one or two Western musical styles, most notably a kind of post-Philip Glass minimalism. In fact, one of the few pieces of previously composed music quoted in the entire series is a specific piece by Philip Glass that appears a couple of times, or in a kind of defamiliarized general classical style. Just to give you a sample of this, I want to focus on the third season. I want to give you two tracks from the soundtrack that's been released for our public consumption. The first thing we're going to hear is a song, and it's a song that actually uses thematic material that's important throughout the third season. What it does is it mixes Indian and Near Eastern melodic tropes, framing a very melancholy song whose lyrics are in Armenian. And so it's sort of this sort of generalized, mysterious East thing. And the second example we're going to hear is a very unsettling, pseudo-Beethoven-esque piece that we associate with the sort of primary sonic environment of the Cylon-based star, the sort of primary Cylon ship. Let's look at those two examples. First, the song, I think it's entitled Distant Sadness. And it really just simply defines this kind of world in circa 2008. next example is the piece that is given the only slightly tongue-in-cheek title, Battlestar Sonata. That uses silence. Okay. Both of those examples are equally distant from us. One is not closer than the other. You really are supposed to sort of get the joke that, oh, it sounds sort of like Beethoven. That's a real knee slapper. But it's still not supposed to be yours in any way. It's supposed to be as foreign to you as all the exotica with the sitar and the Armenian. So that really matters. What's not present in the series, let me reemphasize, is really important. That is to say, particularly, the use of full orchestral fanfare-based materials, which is, after all, the traditional sonic stuff of space opera, and in this show is extremely rare. A deliberate choice by the show's creators from the very beginning of the show's reconception. That is, the orchestral score that we might have heard in an earlier science fiction show, like, for instance, Babylon 5 from the early 90s, seems to have been taken as the sonic equivalent of that older show's visual stylization. This is important because it also tells us that we are to take the score that we do hear in the new Battlestar Galactica as, in some important sense, part of the real. It's part of the reality effect of the show. The other thing that we almost never hear in Battlestar Galactica is anything that remotely resembles recent American popular music. And this is, the colonials tend not to rock and roll. This is extremely important, and we come back to this later. But most of the music that we hear in Battlestar Galactica is non-diegetic. Music appears quite rarely on screen, and this actually marks it off very distinctively from the Star Trek franchise, where people actually have little amateur talent night quite often, and there's a lot of on-screen music making going on as part of the show's idea of what a utopian community really is. There's almost no music in Battlestar Galactica. The diegetic world is a place of beeps and booms, of the sounds of laboring technology and battlefield destruction, of stertorous breaths and muffled calls. The reality of the music that we hear in Battlestar Galactica, then, must be some kind of internal reality. The non-diegetic sound cooperates fully with the expectations that have been carefully trained for us as viewers through years of film and TV viewing. It tells us the truth about what characters are feeling, or it clues us into the real importance of the events we witness on screen. As such, the music tends to hover richly between a kind of third-person positioned commentary and a kind of accretion to a variously constructed first-person point of view. As so often in the underscore, the origin of these points of view is quite obscure. It slips, actually, is probably a better way of putting it. What does it mean that this sonic reality is almost wholly semi-othered in the way that I've been describing? I think part of the answer to this comes from taking into account the ways that world music as such has steadily acquired connotations of the spiritual since its advent in the late 1980s. Now, a number of scholars have delineated parts of this history already, and I'll not rehearse their arguments here because of time. But it's worth observing that by the present, by 2008, the continuing dislocation of timbres and ornaments from their originary styles has reached such a point of abstraction that it becomes increasingly difficult to hear them as ethnic in any useful way. I think of the sonic ecology of Battlestar Galactica as actually something like the situation of ethnic style in Los Angeles, where the vast layering of differences on the urban landscape doesn't so much erase distinctions as make them persistently labeled. Whether it's the disordered capitalism of Hollywood or the post-catastrophic economy of the colonials on Battlestar Galactica, difference has essentially evaporated into style, an ambiguous blessing at best. Another consequence of this ambiguity is that music is no longer used to differentiate classes of character. There's no actual music for good guys versus bad guys in any clearly discernible way. Although the Cylons of the new Battlestar Galactica tend to be more associated with gamelonish timbres, they also seem to like classical music a lot. And humans can actually acquire either of these just as easily as a Cylon. The Cylons, as I say, do not have anything sonically that distinguishes them completely and unequivocally from human beings, which is great because, of course, the new human-like Cylons can't be told apart. The exotica, such as augmented seconds or exotic modal gestures, appear nearly everywhere in the soundscape as part of a generalized interior effect. Now, as I said, the reconceptualization of the Cylons is actually one of the major differences between the original show and the new version. Almost all of the old Cylons were robots created by lizards, that is to say, fairly one-dimensional villains, whose animosity was unchanging and kind of unremarkable. The new Cylons, however, have a very different history, one that we are reminded of every single episode. They were created as a slave race. They were invented in order to serve human beings, but after achieving self-awareness, they revolted and then vanished for 40 years. In the time between their disappearance and their current attack on the colonials, they've continued to develop. Evolve is actually the word the show likes to use. And the Cylons have created for themselves a line of beings who are nearly indistinguishable from humans. To quote the horrified colonials from the very first episode of the miniseries, they look like us now. Indeed, one of the grand themes of the plot of Battlestar Galactica is this question of stable identity. It's questioned and challenged and undermined in innumerable ways. Now, as far as the Cylons go, there are 12 human-like Cylon models, and each exists in multiple iterations. During the course of the first 2.5 seasons, we, as viewers, are introduced to 7 of these models. Now, we quickly discover a number of other important facts about Cylons. They can be programmed so that they don't actually know that they're Cylons, that they don't actually die in most circumstances, but when the body is destroyed, the consciousness downloads into a new copy of the body. We also know that the Cylons are obsessed with human procreation and determined to find a way to have babies themselves, and it seems to depend on human beings. Identity in Battlestar Galactica, in other words, seems to be a real thing, and certainly we have the Cylons and the humans to sort of demonstrate to us, and the music tells us so. But this kind of identity is always fluctuating, subject to rearticulation, consolidation, or further differentiation. The fact that the music, in its articulation of our interiority, also constantly and consistently invokes the spiritual, leads us to another important aspect of the show, its intense aura of fatedness. Now, a lot of science fiction in print or in film, television, has been interested in religion. It might be argued that the meta-genre's investment in the marvelous kind of guarantees the presence of religious questions. But in Battlestar Galactica, this becomes a prominent element of the show's foreground. It is an interesting fact that the Cylons, that is to say most of them anyway, are explicit monotheists and combine many of the features of fundamentalist Muslims and Christians alike. They tend to insist, in addition, that God, the one God, has a plan, and that they know a lot about it. The different models of Cylon have different attitudes towards this. The real hardcore fundamentalist is Cylon model number 6, who insists that, that's what God's plan is, and she knows it, and she's going to help everybody get there. Cylon model number 1, however, tends to be an atheist and sort of scoff at all this sort of nonsense, and so on and so on and so on. So they have very different ideas about God amongst the Cylons, but they're still monotheistic. The colonials, by contrast, pray to a relatively abstract pantheon of gods who carry Greek names. You might think of them as equivalent to the Hellenistic versions of the Greek pantheon, not the Homeric ones. These are more abstract, kind of idealized Zeuses and Athenas and so on and so on. Although several prominent characters among Cylons and humans alike tend to scoff at religion, there's no question that in the plot, both Cylon and colonial religious convictions are often supported. Their scriptures often turn out to be true, in fact. The whole saga of the missing 13th tribe and the search for Earth depends on our accepting that the supernatural is in this universe absolutely real within the terms of the show. Free will, or any kind of contingency in general, thus takes a back seat to a murky form of predestination. And this predestination is something the audience is primed to invest in. The series postulates such inevitability as the normal condition of its story. That, in fact, its story is already written. I think this is actually sort of a clever play because, in fact, the story is already written. Being revealed in installments. That is actually the literal truth of this world, as well as its sort of major plot device. We, as viewers, are thus encouraged to hunt for latent contents and secret meanings everywhere, towards imagining a world that is supercharged with significance. And the saturation of meaning that we experience in watching Battlestar Galactica is reinforced in the structure of the first act of every single episode. The first act of an episode of Battlestar Galactica, and there are really actually only 3 exceptions to this, not counting the extended miniseries and the movie. The first act nearly always falls into 4 parts. Part 1 is an initial segment which provides overarching themes of the series. In the first season, this was preceded by the voiceover, previously on Battlestar Galactica. In this segment, a set of striking and uncanny images appear with emblazoned narrative captions that shift slightly from season 1 to season 3. But in all 3 of the seasons that I'm talking about, when this segment is present, it invariably focuses on the nature and history of the Cylons and concludes with an assertion that they have a plan. The second segment of the first act, which after the first season follows the voiceover, we have in the first segment, then previously on Battlestar Galactica, the second segment, this is always a set of quick moments from earlier episodes, as you would see in most television arc dramas. It's the arc dramas that depend on this structure. The third segment of Act 1 contains the opening dramatic actions of the current episode. This part of the show naturally will typically build to a moment of significant tension before it breaks off. And fourth and final in what I'm calling the first act, the fourth segment contains the main credits of the series, as well as a set of resonant general images of the show's past, followed almost always by a set of proleptic shots from the episode we're about to witness. Now, thus, each segment of Battlestar Galactica's first act performs multiple necessary or desirable functions. The second segment, just to take an obvious example, highlights earlier events especially salient to the narrative of the current episode. Such recapitulations, however, because they're always necessarily selective in their recollections and relevant to only portions of the upcoming action, exert numerous subtle pressures on viewer expectations. That is to say, the previously on Battlestar Galactica segment is less important for the information it conveys than for the kind of narrative desire it constructs. Similarly, the third segment of the opening sequence plunges viewers into dramatic action that is charged enough to generate the viewer investment that will hold us through the main credits sequence and bring us back after the first commercial break. By the end of the third segment, in addition, the temporal gap between the last episode, however many weeks it's been, and the current one is dissolved, and the narrative present tense is more or less firmly installed. The series' narrative, articulated in the first act, then, is framed by 2 meta-narrative segments, and I think we can understand these as a kind of composite refrain. The first section tirelessly reiterating a specific view of Cylon animosity, part slave rebellion, part blowback jihad, and part neo-Cold War, and a final section that commemorates the human experience of the attack and connects it to the continuing story. This is an interesting arrangement, not least because the temporal layering accentuates our story's intense quality of overdetermination. It's really hard, typically, to guess what precisely will happen, but even the most random events of the series tend to carry an aura of destiny or fate. and the co-production solicited from the audience is crucial to the show's aesthetic goals. Now, I want to make this structure concrete with the very first act of episode 3.14. Rapture is its title. For the sake of comprehension, where's the handout? For the sake of comprehension, I've prepared a handout that we left in the copy room.
No, I think I left it on top of my desk.
That we left in Richard's office, which will give you background information that those of you who aren't regular watchers probably need to have. There's a lot of it. I ended up putting it on a handout because I thought, oh my God, it'll take me 5 minutes to tell you everything I think you need to know. So if you don't need it, that's great. If you do, you'll be able to read it as the show goes on. Get yourself some refreshments because we're about to launch into a good 10-minute segment of TV. In fact, these wheels are very disorienting. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. This is for you. I remember all this. Okay, so here's all the information that I think you can profitably use for segments 2 and 3 of Act 1. But what I'd like to talk about for a minute is I want to call your attention to the music that you're going to hear, particularly in segments 1 and 4 of Act 1. This is music that the audience, that we hear in almost every single episode, in exactly this arrangement, in exactly this temporal location, and it strongly shapes the affective cloud that hovers over the show. The music of segment 1 is probably the most immediately recognizable music in the entire soundscape of Battlestar Galactica. A relentless pulsed single pitch in a meter that typically is described in the fan literature as 9/8, but is probably more properly understood as 3/8 plus 3/4, and sort of steady 8 notes, played on the piano with reverb and electronic support, overlaid with a strong major third progression in a muffled synthesized strings, ending with overlapping iterations of this rhythmic pattern that obscure the downbeat and bring the musical tension to a halt on a foreboding grand pause. This music has haunted the entire series, in fact. Its first appearance was near the very beginning of the original miniseries of 2003, at an uncanny moment in which an iteration of Cylon Model number 6, locked in a passionate and unexplained kiss with a colonial officer, announces the beginning of the Cylon's genocidal attack. It's a very spooky, spooky original moment. You never forget it once you've seen it. You don't know what to do with it. Although the music is commonly associated with all the copies of number 6 throughout the series, in its broader application, the music's urgency actually seems to be a literal sonic embodiment of the Cylon's ominous plan. This musical tension never vanishes entirely from the episode, I would say. In the 2 narrative segments that will follow the opening of this particular episode, the normal sonic world of Battlestar Galactica asserts itself. We hear the sort of drones plus drums thing that sort of is the standard sonic world, as well as the occasional duduk or flute, gamelons, throbbing strings, and emotional climaxes, and so forth. But by the end of the first act, in the main credit sequence, we return again to the formal refrain. That is, from season 2 on, composed of 2 kinds of music. The first, a kind of world beat chant to the famous Gayatri mantra from the Vedas, a lament and a prayer in effect, followed by a vigorous groove for Tycho, energetically summoning up the continuing momentum of the plot. The Gayatri mantra is provided with sort of flashback scenes from the entire saga, whereas the Tycho segment is actually proleptic glimpses of what the episode is going to contain. It matters to our apprehension of all this music, however, that it occurs over the ample span of about 10 minutes, more or less. And once again, of course, it's part of the difficulty of dealing with television, that kind of temporal flow is part of the experience and important to our understanding of it. So y'all may as well sit back and relax. With any luck, let's see. probably comes in the mind-blowing final act of episode 3.22, I think it is, the season 3 finale. This is a time when a huge number of important plot points come together. The trial of Gaius Baltar for war crimes has been the final action in the series of the colonials' attempt to come to terms with the painful events of the Cylon occupation on New Caprica. But Baltar's acquittal has left him in danger from a huge number of people who still want him dead. Although Starbuck vanished into a mysterious planetary storm several episodes earlier and is presumed dead, several important characters are still swallowed up in grief over her loss. A recurring prophetic dream of the Opera House on Kobol, a site of revelation, is continually being shared between President Rosalind, who's dying of terminal breast cancer, Athena, the Cylon who just got shot in order to go back to the ship to rescue her daughter, and a copy of Cylon Model Number 6, who's in Galactica's brig. And most important, the identities of the final 5 Cylons have yet to be revealed. This last point is especially crucial, and it matters that the final 5, that is to say, well, 4 of them, come to realize their identities specifically through music, a song that that only they are able to hear. This particular song has been prepared over the previous 2 episodes, mostly through sort of fugitive appearances on the radio, auditory hallucinations, and dreams, and in humming. So this music that's only audible to a very small number of people is, who are actually Cylons, is composed of electric sitar and radio static primarily. These are its primary musical characteristics, in fact, until the actual song is finally unveiled. And its unveiling takes the course of gradual appearances over a tremendously tense 12-minute final sequence. To set it up, Galactica has just made a faster-than-light jump to an area called the Ionian Nebula. But upon arriving there, it experienced an inexplicable total power loss. As the ship restarts its systems, a massive Cylon fleet appears, ready to engage the fleet in apocalyptic battle. This could be sort of the end of it. But the number 6 who's in the brig is having this opera house dream that we've seen repeatedly over the course of the series. And 4 of the crew, namely, sorry for those of you who haven't seen it, but here we go, namely Saltai, Sam Anders, Galen Tyrrell, and Tori Foster, are in the process of coming to realize through hearing that they are in fact Cylons and had never known. Their realization progresses from hearing these bits of inaudible to anyone else static and music to beginning to recite song lyrics. And the lyrics are extraordinary in the context of the series. Not only are they in English, which is something we have not heard typically, but they are actually a recognizable American pop song, namely Bob Dylan's Brooding All Along the Watchtower from Leslie Harding. This is a really important point, actually. As the characters locate themselves in the lyrics in this way, the non-diegetic score morphs into something musically new. An actual heavy metal groove, Phrygian gestures, power chords, buzz tone, and all the appropriate paraphernalia. It's rock and roll that brings the characters together for their musical recognition and realization. The song, in an intensely orientalized arrangement that does recall primarily Jimi Hendrix's stunning cover of the tune, much more than Dylan's original, manifests fully at the very end of this 12-minute act, as the camera work finally sort of culminates in a vertiginous whirl towards a shot of nothing less than Earth itself. So, this is an amazing sequence, and it's sort of what's
Which episode?
Oh, this is going to be the last episode. So you have to go all the way down to more over here. Venues, what a pain in the ass they are. Keep going. And you're going to have to do this all over again. Crossroads Part 1, all the way down. All right, now we need to get to track 4 in this episode. If you hit play episode and advance to track 4, we'll be all set. Perfect. And you will be able to hear how
We have
the
negative
presence of the
auxiliary
song
power
is
for our
very
batteries only.
gradually
Get ready for an engine
over the
restart.
course of the 12 minutes.
DC-6 needs to get down there and muster right away.
Got about a second there.
All right, no 96 personnel.
Where are you taking me to?
To your new life. Come on.
This is the opera house thing. Like most Cylon things, it's more classical.
Said the Joker to the thief. There's too much confusion here.
I can't get no relief. This isn't happening. Please tell me this isn't happening.
So that's it. After all this time, a switch goes off just like that.
Whoa. Oh, no way. I don't believe this. I'm not buying this. This is a trick. Come on, we're not.
What is that? Song.
All right, that's enough, God damn it! Deadbolt that fracking door!
"40 years in the service. 40 years.
wars. Combat. Locked in that dungeon on New Caprica. Ellen? My God. What about Ellen?
Not after all this. Not after the resistance and the occupation. And after watching my friends die one after another for fucking this.
Sam,
Whoa, just stay the frack away from me.
Sam, it's true. We're silent. And we have been from the start.
I don't know what's going on.
Some kind of power surge. Give me a damage report immediately.
The power outage was fleet-wide, Admiral. It was also simultaneously restored to all ships.
Admiral, Admiral.
Traitors contact. Mass assault on fleet on intercept course.
Mr. Gita, sound action stations immediately. XO, one emergency jump. Entire fleet.
Sir, all fleet ships were powered down during the outage. It'll take at least 20 minutes to spool up the ITL drives.
We just don't have 20 minutes.
Action stations, set condition 1 throughout the ship. This is not a drill. All Viper pilots report to Vipers immediately. Inbound Cylon fleet. I repeat, action stations, set condition 1 throughout the ship. This is not a drill.
God. What are we gonna do?
The ship is under attack. We do our jobs. Report to your stations.
Where's the stations?
My name is Saltai. I am an officer in the Colonial Fleet. Whatever else I am, whatever else it means, that's the man I want to be. And if I die today, that's the man I'll be.
Get that bird in the tube! Get those steps up! Get those steps up! Come on! Unload all nuclear weapons.
Yes, sir.
It's good to see you, Colonel.
Good to be here, Admiral. You can count on me.
I've never doubted it.
I'm here if you need me, Madam President.
There must be some way out of here. Send the joker to the thief. There's too much confusion.
Alert Vipers are away. Who's in Viper 3?
Like Apollo, I'm in Viper 3. I have a bogey in my 10. I'm gonna go check it out. No reason to get excited. The Fifi kind of spoke. There are many
Where'd he go?
among us.
Where the frick did you go?
But you and I, we've been through that, and this
gonna be okay. I've been to Earth. I know where it is. And I'm gonna take us there.
Now, speaking of time, we really are out of it, so let me just summarize very, very quickly a thing that we could talk about probably for another hour. The music in this last act of season 3 is like nothing previously heard on Battlestar Galactica. And it's worth noting that Ron Moore, by his own account, worried that its very familiarity was likely to be its great weakness. In conversation with the series' main composer, Vera Crary, Moore articulated a kind of theory of cyclic time and multiple worlds as a kind of justification for using this. I think there are a number of things that we can actually take from this. One direction of exploration might be to consider the sort of persistence, the unexpected persistence, perhaps, of a kind of post-Christian temporality that comes from the show's origin in the 70s in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you know anything about Mormon theology, one of the things you know is that this kind of cyclic theory is actually fundamental to the way that the Latter-day Saints see the world. And I think that the requirement of this show, that there be this cyclic time, you hear repeatedly in the show, all the mantra, all of this has happened before, all of this will happen again, is, I think, sort of a sediment of that original process that is still really present. Another way we might consider this is to think about the presence of this intensely predetermined cyclic quality in the show that manifests in the music as well as in plot points as something between the persistence of and a nostalgia for a vision of cosmic order as a way of defining selfhood. I'm thinking particularly of the work of Charles Taylor and sort of talking about the history of selfhood in the West particularly and modernity, as contrasting a notion of sort of a disengaged self with the older investment in a self that is formed as a kind of adjunct to a kind of cosmic vision. This seems to me to be a show that's deeply invested in the notion of cosmic vision, but not necessarily as a good thing. In fact, this cosmic order that seems to be present, this plan that the Cylons may have or know about or be involved with, is not by any means a good thing, necessarily. The show has frequently been described as dark to sort of mark exactly this pessimistic, potentially catastrophic result that we don't really know how to answer yet. All reports about the last section of the last season suggest that it's not a cheerful thing, in fact. Another way to consider this question, particularly of the presence of all along the Watchtower, which has actually been covered dozens and dozens of times, is to think about it as a kind of commentary on the ontology of replication and copy, which is something that the show has been deeply preoccupied with all the way through its inception. Not only in considering the nature of Cylon identity, but also in this whole question of repetition and cyclic time. Two more things to say is, one is we might consider the question of whether this is actually all a meta-reflection on the condition of TV and our experience of it. In fact, since TV is a writer's and producer's medium, predestination is the norm in most television shows. It's simply that some shows will heighten this. They will actually make this part of the foreground instead of trying to construct the effect of contingency. And that would be a long conversation. And last but not least, I would certainly say that among all the things that it may be, I think that the presence of something like All Along the Watchtower testifies to the possibility of understanding the show as reflecting on layers of historical trauma that have sort of become sedimented into the present. That the show is concerned about 9/11 is not the end of it. The presence of All Along the Watchtower shows that the ghosts of Vietnam and the sort of problem of inhabiting a still God-haunted America seem to be sort of a constant thing to be worked out on television. With that, I should actually stop, and I thank you for all this time you've let me have, and I hope you like the segments. So, thanks. Just simply sort of converse casually.
Well, maybe if we could take just 2 or 3 questions, and then there's more line and whatnot. If there are any, anyone like
You know, one of the things that I'm really curious about when we talk about when we talk about the music of a TV show like this is, you know, to what extent is this really work for hire, as opposed to independent creative work on the part of the composer? And did you have any insights into the nature of the collaboration of the producers of the show with the composer, and what they were trying to achieve, and what the independent creative impetus the composer really could exert on it?
I can say a few things about that, actually. The composer is an interesting guy. He was a USC student who was actually one of Jerry Goldsmith's last students. So he sort of got this very distinguished film and TV lineage. He was brought on in the actual first season of the show. So he didn't actually have anything to do with the miniseries. He was the second composer involved. He takes up a lot of the material the first composer did, but it absolutely is work for hire, which of course before, you know, about what, 1800 or so is the norm for musicians. You know, Mozart worked for hire when he could, when he was lucky. So really, I think of this as in one way, a kind of return to the norm for musicians, rather than anything sort of unusual. As far as creative input goes, McCreary has a lot of space to decide things for particular cues. It is interesting, he has a website. It's a really good website. It's completely worth looking at, in fact. There are some things that happened in the course of working on the show that, I don't know, they're very suggestive. He didn't originally plan for the show to be especially leitmotivic, and it got that way. I think because it's actually a really good way of sort of condensing and telegraphing information. Most of the cues of that nature he developed himself. I'm actually finding this hard to answer because I can't do a lot without actually talking a lot about the way that he's deeply enmeshed in the really complicated economy of sound in Los Angeles. And just a couple of examples of this. So he's trained as a film and TV composer, you know, sort of like really impeccable credentials in that. He also is not only involved in sort of writing a lot of different shows. He does Galactica, he does the Sarah Connor Chronicles, he does Eureka, he's done a couple of other things, I think, as well. He also, on the side, has a rock and roll band where he plays with a couple of former members of Boingo Boingo, the most famous member of Boingo Boingo, of course, being Danny Elfman. So it's just this incredibly intricate network of social relations that underwrite this activity and make me not sure how to answer the question.
Well, maybe I can help you by giving you context of what prompts this. There was just a little while ago, there was a really fascinating segment on NPR with, and I wish I'd written down the guy's name, a composer who actually does themes for the network.